The little paper swan was still standing beside 5-year-old Grace Kelly's half-finished plate when the restaurant manager pointed toward the door. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you can't pay the full bill, you need to leave now." Abigail Kelly quietly gathered her children without arguing, shielding them from dozens of staring eyes. As the door swung open, a cold evening breeze carried Grace's paper swan onto the floor. An elderly man near the window bent down, picked it up, and slipped it carefully into his coat pocket. 1 year later, Abigail walked back through the same entrance, not carrying an apology this time, but holding the keys to the restaurant. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If stories about kindness, resilience, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this. Long before Harbor Table became the place where her dignity was questioned, it had been the place where Abigail Kelly taught her children that ordinary moments were worth celebrating. Charleston always seemed to wake before the sun. At 4:30 every morning, while most apartment windows remained dark, a single light glowed from Unit 3B of an aging brick building on Meeting Street. Abigail slipped quietly from beneath a faded blue blanket, careful not to wake Ethan and Grace, whose bedroom was separated from the tiny kitchen by nothing more than a thin folding divider. She never needed an alarm anymore. Years of balancing too many responsibilities had trained her body to rise before exhaustion could argue otherwise. The first sound every morning was the old coffee maker sputtering to life. The second was the soft rhythm of measuring flour into a large stainless steel bowl. Before leaving for her shift as a prep cook, Abigail baked cinnamon rolls for neighbors who had become loyal customers. The extra money rarely exceeded $35 a day, but those dollars often decided whether the family could afford fresh fruit or had to settle for canned vegetables until payday. She hummed quietly while kneading dough, a habit she had inherited from her grandmother. When the rolls entered the oven, she packed 2 lunchboxes. One belonged to Ethan. The other belonged to Grace. The lunchboxes never matched. Ethan's had a faded picture of astronauts that was peeling at the corners. Grace's was covered with tiny yellow flowers drawn by Ethan using permanent markers after the original design had disappeared years earlier. At exactly 5:40, Abigail gently knocked on the divider. "Rise and shine, my favorite people." Ethan sat up almost immediately. Grace buried herself deeper beneath her blanket. "5 more minutes," the little girl mumbled. "You said that yesterday." "I know. And the day before." "I know that too." Abigail laughed softly. Some mornings, laughter was the only luxury she could afford. After breakfast, Ethan automatically tied Grace's shoes while Abigail searched the apartment for the missing permission slip that somehow disappeared every school week. They moved around one another with practiced rhythm, less like a family struggling to survive, and more like a small team that had learned every member mattered. By 6:30, Abigail was walking to the bus stop while the children headed toward school with a neighbor who watched several kids in the building before classes began. Before boarding the bus, Grace always hugged her mother twice, once for goodbye, once just in case. When Abigail asked what "just in case" meant, Grace would simply smile. "In case somebody needs an extra hug today." That answer stayed with Abigail every single shift. The kitchen where she worked was hot, noisy, and constantly rushed. Most customers never imagined the people preparing vegetables before sunrise or washing industrial mixing bowls after midnight. To many guests, meals simply appeared. Abigail understood something different. Every plate represented someone's work, someone's aching feet, someone missing their own family dinner while making another family's evening easier. She treated every ingredient with care because she believed food carried emotion, even if no one ever noticed. Her coworkers respected her because she never complained loudly. When someone called in sick, she quietly covered another station. When new employees forgot recipes, she helped instead of criticizing. When customers sent food back untouched, she never cursed them. She simply started over. One afternoon, another cook asked why she worked so hard when management barely noticed. Abigail smiled while chopping parsley. Character doesn't disappear just because nobody's watching. The older dishwasher nodded from across the room. He had overheard every word. Those words followed him home. Friday evenings were different. No matter how difficult the week had been, Friday belonged to Ethan and Grace. The children called it family dinner night. Sometimes they shared one pizza. Sometimes they bought tacos from a food truck by the waterfront. Sometimes it was only grilled cheese sandwiches at a neighborhood diner. The meal itself never mattered. Keeping the promise did. Even when money was painfully tight, Abigail refused to cancel Friday unless there was absolutely no other choice. "It reminds us we're still living," she often said, "not just surviving." One Friday, as they sat together eating inexpensive pancakes at a neighborhood cafe, Grace began folding her paper napkin with complete concentration. Her tiny fingers struggled with the corners. Ethan leaned over. "You're doing it backwards." "I know." "No, you don't." "I do." "No." Abigail watched them with an exhausted smile. Finally, after several attempts, Grace lifted a slightly crooked paper swan. "It looks funny." "It looks perfect," Abigail answered. Grace giggled. "It can be our lucky bird." "Our lucky swan," Ethan corrected. From that night on, Grace folded one paper swan almost every Friday. She lined them along the apartment windowsill. Some were tiny, some leaned sideways, some barely resembled birds. But Abigail never threw a single one away. Whenever Grace asked why, Abigail always gave the same answer. Because someone made them with love. The sentence became another quiet tradition inside their little apartment. Weeks passed. The windowsill slowly filled with white paper swans, looking toward the street below. Neighbors smiled whenever they noticed them through the window. One elderly woman from downstairs once asked why there were so many. Grace proudly answered before Abigail could speak. "They remind us another good day is coming." The woman smiled with tears gathering in tired eyes. "I think I needed to hear that." Abigail looked at her daughter differently after that. Children often created hope adults had forgotten how to imagine. Late every Thursday evening, after the children had gone to bed, Abigail sat alone at the small kitchen table with a notebook. Every bill was written carefully. Rent, electricity, bus fare, groceries, school supplies, medicine. She calculated every dollar 3 different ways. Sometimes the numbers cooperated. Often they refused. Still, beside every page of expenses, she wrote something else. Friday dinner. No matter how little remained, she tried to protect that line. Because one meal together around a table gave Ethan and Grace something poverty could not steal. The feeling that they still belonged somewhere. As another Friday approached, Abigail zipped her worn brown wallet closed and counted the cash inside. She smiled with quiet relief. There would be enough. Or at least that was what she believed. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, one unexpected mistake would change everything they thought they understood about kindness, pride, and second chances. Friday arrived with clear blue skies, but by 7 o'clock that morning, Abigail Kelly already knew the day was slipping beyond her control. She had just finished unloading vegetables in the restaurant kitchen when her phone vibrated inside the pocket of her apron. The message came from her landlord. "Reminder, rent is due Monday. Please don't fall behind again." She stared at the screen for a moment before slipping the phone away. She hadn't forgotten. She simply hadn't figured out how she was going to solve it. The morning became even harder when the head chef gathered the kitchen staff before lunch service. "I'm sorry, everyone," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Business has been slower than expected this month. Corporate wants labor costs reduced." He glanced down at the schedule. "Abigail, we're cutting your Saturday shift." Her heart sank. Saturday was usually her longest shift, 8 hours, time and a half pay. Almost $160 before taxes. Money she had already mentally spent on rent groceries and Ethan's overdue school field trip fee. She forced a smile anyway. I understand. She didn't, but understanding wouldn't change the schedule. After work, she walked 3 blocks to the parking lot where her 12-year-old silver Honda Civic waited, or at least she hoped it would. The engine coughed twice before dying completely. She tried again. Nothing. A mechanic from the neighboring shop leaned over the hood after listening for less than a minute. Alternator's gone. Can it wait? He looked apologetic. If you keep driving it, you'll probably end up stranded. How much? He checked a tablet. About $430. Abigail thanked him. She didn't explain that her checking account hadn't held $400 all year. Instead, she called Ethan. Buddy, Mom's going to be a little late. Car, you know me too well. I'll warm dinner. She smiled despite herself. You don't have to. I already started. The call ended. She walked nearly 40 minutes home carrying her work shoes in one hand because the blisters had become unbearable. When she finally climbed the apartment stairs, the smell of tomato soup drifted through the hallway. Inside, Ethan stood on a chair stirring the pot, while Grace carefully arranged 3 mismatched bowls on the table. Grace looked up. It's Friday tomorrow. I know. Family dinner night. It is. You promised we could go somewhere new. Abigail froze for half a heartbeat. She had made that promise almost 3 weeks earlier, before the reduced hours, before the broken car, before every unexpected expense seemed determined to arrive at once. She set her bag down. We'll figure something out. Grace smiled as if those words settled everything. Children had remarkable faith. Adults usually called it innocence. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Abigail opened her banking app. She frowned. Available balance, $18.47. That couldn't be right. She refreshed the screen. The same number appeared. She searched through recent transactions until she found the explanation. Her monthly state assistance deposit had been placed on temporary hold because of an identity verification review. An automated message explained the process could take 3 to 5 business days. 3 to 5 days. She whispered the words aloud. Rent was due in 3. Family dinner night was tomorrow. She rubbed her temples before calling customer service. After 27 minutes on hold, a polite representative answered. I'm sorry, Miss Kelly. Until verification is complete, we can't release the funds. I've been receiving the same deposit for nearly 2 years. I understand. I have children. I understand. Those 2 words sounded sincere. They also changed absolutely nothing. She thanked the woman anyway. The representative wasn't responsible for the system. When Abigail finally closed the phone, silence filled the apartment. The kind of silence that only appeared after hope had been delayed once again. She looked toward the windowsill. More than 20 paper swans stood in a crooked line, glowing softly beneath the streetlight outside. Grace had made another one earlier that week. Its wings weren't even. Its neck leaned slightly forward. Abigail picked it up gently. The paper felt impossibly light. She remembered what Grace always said. They remind us another good day is coming. She wanted desperately to believe that. Saturday afternoon arrived warmer than expected. Ethan quietly packed a small backpack. Grace wore the yellow sweater she called her restaurant sweater. It had tiny white buttons shaped like flowers. She only wore it on special occasions. Abigail counted the money inside her wallet 3 separate times. 1 $10 bill, 1 $5, 3 $1 bills, 1 quarter, 2 dimes, 2 pennies. Exactly $18.47. She had already checked Harbor Table's online menu. If they ordered carefully, they could still enjoy dinner. Nothing extra, no desserts, no appetizers. Just enough to keep the tradition alive. As they waited for the city bus, Ethan noticed his mother staring at her wallet. "We don't have to go." Abigail looked at him. "Yes, we do." "But—" She gently squeezed his shoulder. "I promised." Grace suddenly tugged on Abigail's sleeve. "I forgot something." She reached into her tiny backpack and proudly held up a folded white napkin she had brought from home. "I'm making a better swan today." Abigail laughed softly. "You're bringing your own. The restaurant ones might be busy." "The napkins are busy. They're helping people eat." Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically. Grace ignored him. She carefully folded the corners while sitting on the bus, her tongue peeking out in concentration. An elderly passenger smiled as he watched. "What are you making?" "A lucky swan." "What does it do?" Grace looked completely serious. "It reminds people they're welcome." The old man nodded thoughtfully. "I think the world could use more of those." Abigail looked out the bus window toward the Charleston waterfront, where Harbor Table stood waiting in the distance. She believed she was taking her children to dinner. She had no idea they were about to walk into the moment that would divide their lives into 2 chapters: everything before that evening, and everything that would come after. Harbor Table overlooked the Charleston waterfront like it had for decades, its tall windows glowing with warm amber light as families gathered inside for their Saturday dinners. To anyone passing by, it looked like the kind of place where memories were made. Abigail hoped it would become one more happy memory for Ethan and Grace. A young hostess greeted them with a friendly smile and led them to a small table near the center of the dining room. Grace carefully placed her unfinished paper swan beside the salt shaker before climbing into her chair. "It can watch us eat," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "Just don't let it steal my fries." For a little while, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers, plates clinked, people laughed. Outside, horse-drawn carriages rolled slowly past the restaurant windows, carrying tourists beneath the fading evening sky. Abigail opened the menu she had already studied online the night before. She had done the math 3 different times. If everyone ordered carefully, they could stay within their budget. "No soda tonight," she said gently. "Water's fine." "Okay," Ethan answered immediately. Grace nodded. "I like water." They ordered grilled cheese for Grace, a simple cheeseburger for Ethan, and a bowl of chicken vegetable soup with bread for Abigail. Nothing extra, nothing unnecessary. As the food arrived, Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. "It smells amazing." Grace broke off half of her sandwich. "Mom, you can have this piece." Abigail laughed softly. "You eat your dinner?" "I'm sharing." "You already share enough." Grace pushed the bread toward her anyway. Abigail accepted a tiny bite. Sometimes accepting kindness from a child was another way of teaching generosity mattered. For nearly 40 minutes, the world felt peaceful. They talked about Ethan's science project. Grace proudly explained how she wanted to become a person who makes restaurants happy. "What does that mean?" Abigail asked. "A boss who smiles." Even Ethan laughed. When dinner ended, Abigail reached for her wallet with complete confidence. She counted the bills once. Then again. Something immediately felt wrong. The total on the receipt read $22.81. She blinked. That couldn't be possible. She quickly reviewed every item. Then she noticed it. A mandatory weekend service surcharge she had overlooked on the online menu. $4.34. Enough to ruin everything. Her fingers tightened around the receipt. $18.47. She counted again anyway. 10, 5, 3, coins. Exactly what she already knew. Grace looked up. "Mom." Abigail forced a smile. "Everything's okay." She quietly raised her hand as their server approached. "I'm terribly sorry," she said in a low voice. "I misunderstood the final price. My assistant's payment was delayed this week. I can leave everything I have tonight and return first thing tomorrow morning with the remaining balance." The young waitress hesitated. "I'll ask my manager." A few moments later, Mark Reynolds appeared, tall, neatly dressed, professional. His smile disappeared the moment he looked at the receipt. "You don't have enough. I'm short by $4.34. He folded his arms. "We don't allow unpaid balances." "I completely understand. My payment is being released Monday morning. I can even leave my driver's license if necessary." "We've heard every story." Abigail kept her voice calm. "This isn't a story. I'm sure. I've brought my children here in good faith, and you should have made sure you could pay." Several nearby conversations began to fade as people sensed tension. Abigail lowered her voice even further. "I'm asking for 1 day." "I'm saying no." Ethan stared at the table. Grace hugged her paper swan against her chest. Abigail reached into her purse. "I have $18.47. She placed every bill and every coin carefully onto the table. "Please take all of it. I'll bring the remaining amount tomorrow." Mark didn't even look at the money. "If you can't pay the bill in full, you'll need to leave now." A silence spread through the dining room. Not loud, not dramatic. The uncomfortable silence that made people suddenly very interested in pretending not to stare. An elderly couple paused halfway through their meal. A businessman slowly lowered his fork. Near the large front window, a gray-haired man quietly watched without interrupting. William Harper had come to Harbor Table almost every Saturday since retiring. Most employees no longer recognized the founder of the restaurant chain. He preferred it that way. He observed people better when they didn't know who he was. Now he watched the young mother standing beside her chair. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't making threats. She wasn't demanding special treatment. She simply looked tired, deeply tired. "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. "I truly believed I had enough." Mark glanced toward the entrance. "I'm going to ask you one final time to leave." Grace looked up at her mother with frightened eyes. "Did we do something bad?" The question landed like a stone in Abigail's heart. She immediately knelt beside her daughter. "No, sweetheart." "Then why are we leaving?" Abigail brushed a loose curl away from Grace's face. "Sometimes grown-up problems have nothing to do with children." Ethan quietly removed the last pickle from his untouched plate and placed it onto his mother's. He knew she liked pickles, even now, even here. Abigail swallowed hard. She picked up her purse, thanked the waitress for serving them, and carefully gathered her children. She thanked the waitress, not the manager, not the room full of silent strangers. The waitress looked as though she wanted to cry. As Grace climbed down from her chair, she accidentally left her paper swan beside the plate. The front door opened. A cool breeze swept through the dining room. The tiny white swan fluttered across the polished wooden floor until it stopped beside William Harper's polished brown shoes. He slowly bent down. He picked up the fragile paper bird with both hands, smoothing one bent wing, before slipping it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he looked toward the door, where Abigail disappeared into the Charleston night, with Ethan holding one hand and Grace holding the other. For the first time in many years, William no longer saw a restaurant. He saw everything his life's work was never supposed to become. The walk home felt much longer than it had only an hour earlier. Charleston's evening breeze carried the smell of salt water across the quiet streets, but none of them noticed. Grace held Abigail's left hand. Ethan held her right. No one spoke for nearly 3 blocks. The only sound came from passing cars and the soft tapping of Grace's little shoes against the sidewalk. Abigail wished she could erase the last 15 minutes from her children's memories. She couldn't, so she focused on what she still could protect, their dignity. As they reached the bus stop, Ethan finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Mom." She looked at him in surprise. For what? I ordered the orange juice. His voice barely rose above a whisper. If I'd just asked for water. Abigail stopped walking immediately. She turned toward her son and gently placed both hands on his shoulders. Look at me. He hesitated before lifting his eyes. None of this happened because of orange juice. But no. Her voice remained soft but firm. You did absolutely nothing wrong. I made the bill bigger. You were a little boy having dinner with your family. He blinked hard, trying not to cry. Children are allowed to enjoy orange juice. The words broke something inside him. He threw his arms around her. I thought I made everything worse. Abigail hugged him tightly. You never make my life worse. You make it worth living. Grace wrapped herself around both of them, creating an awkward little circle beneath the dim light of the bus shelter. After a moment, she frowned. My swan. Abigail froze. The paper swan. It was still inside Harbor Table. Grace looked down at her empty hands. I forgot her. Abigail knelt again. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Grace looked toward the dark street instead of crying. Maybe she wanted to stay. Why would she? So she can remind somebody to be nice. The innocence in that answer left Abigail speechless. Even after what had happened, Grace still believed kindness could grow in difficult places. The bus arrived a few minutes later. The ride home was unusually quiet. Grace eventually fell asleep with her head resting against Abigail's shoulder. Ethan stared out the window the entire way. The streetlights reflected across the glass, making it impossible to tell whether the moisture on his face came from the lights outside or tears he refused to wipe away. When they reached the apartment building, the hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old paint. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor from downstairs, opened her apartment door just as they passed. How was family dinner night? Abigail forced a tired smile. It didn't go exactly as planned. Mrs. Jenkins noticed the expression on Ethan's face. She didn't ask another question. Instead, she disappeared inside her apartment for a moment before returning with 3 warm chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a paper towel. I baked too many. Everyone in the building knew that wasn't true. Mrs. Jenkins never baked too many. She simply knew when someone needed to feel cared for. Grace accepted hers with both hands. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins smiled. You're very welcome, sweetheart. Abigail quietly mouthed the words, thank you, before leading the children upstairs. Inside their apartment, Ethan disappeared into his room without changing clothes. A few minutes later, Abigail gently knocked on the half-open door. He sat at his small desk, sketching in a notebook. Instead of buildings, he was drawing the restaurant. Every window, every table, every chair, except one. Their table was empty. Abigail sat beside him. You don't have to pretend you're okay. I'm not. I know. He looked at the unfinished drawing. I've never seen people look at us like that before. She understood exactly what he meant. Not angry, not cruel, just uncomfortable, as though poverty had become something contagious. I'm sorry you had to experience that. Ethan shook his head. I'm not embarrassed because we didn't have enough money. He paused. I'm embarrassed because everyone watched. Abigail closed her eyes for one brief moment. Children often described pain more honestly than adults. Meanwhile, Grace wandered into the kitchen carrying a fresh white napkin. She climbed onto her chair and quietly began folding another swan. Abigail watched without interrupting. The little girl's fingers moved slowly, carefully recreating something she had just lost. When she finished, she carried the new swan to her mother. This one is for you, Abigail smiled. I thought it was your lucky swan. Grace nodded. It is. Then why give it away? Because I think you need luck more than me tonight. For the first time since leaving Harbor Table, Abigail couldn't hold back her tears. She hugged Grace so tightly, the tiny paper bird nearly crumpled between them. Later, after both children were asleep, Abigail placed the swan inside her worn leather wallet, right behind her driver's license, right beside the 18 cents she had left after paying every dollar she could toward the restaurant bill. She opened her laptop. Friends had already begun sending messages. Someone had apparently recognized her inside Harbor Table. One text read, "You should post what happened online." Another said, "Call the local news." A third suggested filing a complaint against the restaurant. Abigail stared at the screen for several minutes. Then she closed the laptop without answering any of them. She had no desire to become famous because of one humiliating evening. She didn't want strangers arguing over who was right. She didn't want Ethan and Grace remembered as those poor kids from the restaurant. She wanted something much simpler, to move forward. The next morning she returned to work before sunrise, as if nothing had happened. She chopped onions, prepared vegetables, cleaned cutting boards. No one there knew she had cried herself to sleep only hours earlier. Across town, inside a quiet waterfront home overlooking Charleston Harbor, William Harper placed a carefully folded paper swan onto his desk. He had intended to throw it away after leaving the restaurant. Instead, he found himself smoothing its bent wings with remarkable care. He looked at the small, handwritten note resting beside an old family photograph. Years earlier, when Harbor Table had opened its first location, he had written a promise to himself. No guest should ever leave this place feeling smaller than when they walked in. He read the sentence 3 times. Then he looked back at the paper swan. Somewhere in Charleston, he knew a little girl believed that kindness could still grow where it had once been forgotten. For the first time in years, William wondered whether the greatest failure of his career had not been losing customers. It had been allowing his own values to disappear without noticing. And before the next sunrise, he quietly asked his longtime assistant to find everything she could about a woman named Abigail Kelly. Monday morning arrived with a steady rain that washed Charleston's streets clean, but did little to ease the heaviness Abigail Kelly carried inside her. She had barely slept. Not because she kept replaying the humiliation at Harbor Table. That memory still hurt, but another concern demanded her attention. The identity verification hold on her assistance payment. At exactly 8:12 a.m., during her first break at work, Abigail checked her bank account again. The balance had changed. Not by much. The deposit had finally cleared. She immediately withdrew enough money to cover the remaining restaurant bill before paying rent online. Then, during her lunch break, she walked 3 blocks through the drizzle back to Harbor Table. The hostess recognized her at once. Her smile faltered for a brief moment before she quietly welcomed Abigail inside. "I'm here to pay what I still owe," Abigail explained. The young woman nodded. "I'll get the manager." A few moments later, Mark Reynolds stepped into the lobby. His expression revealed neither surprise nor apology. "You came back." "I said I would." Abigail placed an envelope on the reception counter. Inside were $4.34, along with a handwritten note. The note contained only one sentence. "A promise kept matters even when no one expects it." Mark counted the money without reading the note. "Thank you." It was a routine thank you, not the kind that carried reflection. Abigail simply nodded. She turned to leave without another word. As the front door closed behind her, someone at a nearby table quietly watched her walk away. William Harper. He had deliberately come earlier than usual, not because he expected gratitude, because he wanted to know whether the woman he had seen 2 nights before would return. She had. Not to argue, not to shame anyone, not to demand justice. She had returned because she had given her word. William picked up his coffee cup, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. People often revealed who they truly were when no reward waited at the end of the effort. Abigail had just revealed everything he needed to know. That afternoon, William drove to a modest brick office downtown, where his longtime assistant, Claire Morgan, was organizing scholarship applications for the Harper Hospitality Foundation. Claire had worked beside William for nearly 25 years. She knew the look on his face. "You found someone." William smiled faintly. "I think someone found me." He handed her a small slip of paper. Written on it was one name: Abigail Kelly. "I need everything you can legally find." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Business. Human." She understood immediately. By Wednesday afternoon, a thick folder rested on William's desk. He opened it slowly. Employment history, excellent attendance, strong performance reviews, volunteer work at a church soup kitchen before Ethan was born, no criminal record, no lawsuits, no public complaints. Then he reached the education section: Bachelor of Hospitality Management, Charleston State University, status program incomplete, completed credits 87%. William frowned. He continued reading. Academic standing dean's list. Faculty recommendation for graduate leadership program. Withdrawal reason: medical leave during pregnancy. Never returned. He leaned back quietly. Nearly finished. 1 semester away. His eyes drifted toward the paper swan still resting beside his desk lamp. "So close," he whispered. Claire looked over from the opposite chair. "Life interrupted." William nodded slowly. "No," he corrected himself. "Responsibility interrupted." There was a difference. Many people abandoned dreams because they stopped caring. Others stepped away because someone else needed them more. Abigail belonged to the second group. Later that evening, William visited Charleston State University, not as a wealthy donor, simply as an old alumnus attending a board meeting. After the meeting ended, he quietly asked the dean about one former student. The dean smiled immediately. "Abigail Kelly. You remember her?" "I remember students who make professors believe the future is in good hands." William listened carefully. "She wasn't just one of our strongest students," the dean continued. "She was the one who stayed after class helping classmates understand operations management. She organized food drives, volunteered during hurricane relief efforts, and somehow still graduated near the top of every semester." "What happened?" The dean sighed. "Her son was born prematurely." Silence settled between them. "We tried convincing her to continue online, but childcare hospital visits and work became impossible." He paused before adding quietly, "I always hoped she'd come back." William thanked him and walked slowly toward his car. Rain had begun falling again. Inside his coat pocket, his fingers brushed against the folded paper swan. For the first time in years, memories of his late wife surfaced with startling clarity. Margaret had loved mentoring young restaurant workers. She often repeated the same sentence whenever managers complained about inexperienced employees. "Don't ask whether someone deserves an opportunity. Ask what they might become if someone finally gives them one." William stopped walking beneath a street lamp. He suddenly realized something. If he simply wrote Abigail a check, nothing meaningful would change. Money solved emergencies. Opportunity changed generations. The next morning, Claire entered his office carrying a folder labeled Harper Hospitality Career Advancement Fellowship. It was a little-used program created years earlier to help working adults finish hospitality education. Almost no one applied anymore because few people even knew it existed. William opened the guidelines. Recipients would receive tuition assistance, mentorship, leadership training, and flexible scheduling. No publicity, no media, no obligations beyond completing the program. He smiled. "This?" Claire looked surprised. "You want to reopen it?" "I want to remember why we created it." "But she'll recognize your name." William shook his head. "Not if the invitation comes through the foundation." "You don't want her to know?" "Not yet." Claire studied him for a moment before smiling. "I'll prepare the paperwork." 3 days later, after finishing another exhausting shift, Abigail opened her mailbox, expecting nothing more than utility bills and advertisements. Instead, she found a cream-colored envelope bearing an unfamiliar logo. The Harper Hospitality Foundation. She frowned. She had never heard of it. Standing in the dim apartment hallway, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter inviting her to apply for a fellowship designed for hospitality workers whose education had been interrupted by life circumstances. The application deadline was only 2 weeks away. Abigail read the letter twice. Then a third time, she looked toward her apartment door, where Ethan and Grace waited inside. The dream she had quietly buried years earlier had not suddenly come back to life. It had merely knocked softly, asking whether she still had the courage to answer. Abigail placed the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for almost an hour before opening it again. The children had already gone to bed. Outside rain tapped softly against the apartment window, blurring the lights of passing cars into streaks of gold and white. She read every line a fourth time. The Harper Hospitality Foundation Fellowship covered tuition for professional hospitality leadership courses, management certification mentoring, and internship placement. Recipients were selected based on character, work ethic, and leadership potential rather than financial status alone. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence caught her attention. "We are looking for people who have already demonstrated leadership long before receiving a title." She folded the letter carefully. Leadership. She laughed quietly to herself. "I can barely keep the lights on." Still, something inside her refused to throw the envelope away. The following evening after dinner, Ethan noticed it lying beside the family budget notebook. "What's that?" Abigail hesitated. "A scholarship?" Grace's eyes grew wide. "Like college?" "Not exactly." "Then what?" "It helps people become better restaurant managers." Grace smiled immediately. "You already know restaurants." "I know kitchens." "That's almost the same." Abigail shook her head. "It really isn't." Ethan picked up the brochure and read silently. "They're only accepting 12 people." "I know. You should apply." She looked at him with a tired smile. "I haven't been in school for years." "So, I'm older than most applicants." "So, I work full-time." "So, I have you and Grace." Ethan gently placed the brochure back on the table. "And that's exactly why you should apply." His words lingered in the room long after the conversation ended. 2 nights later, Abigail attended the fellowship information session held in a conference room at Charleston State University. She almost turned around twice before reaching the entrance. Everyone else looked polished, confident. Several applicants arrived wearing business suits. Abigail came straight from work wearing inexpensive black slacks and a navy blouse she had ironed 3 times that morning. She quietly took a seat in the last row. At the front of the room, foundation representatives explained the program: leadership development, restaurant finance, conflict resolution, operations management, customer experience, capstone project. The words awakened memories she had tried to bury years earlier. She remembered sitting in classrooms discussing menu engineering and service culture. She remembered believing she would someday manage a restaurant where employees felt respected and guests felt welcome. Life had interrupted that dream, not destroyed it, simply placed it on a shelf she no longer dared to reach. When the presentation ended, applicants were invited to introduce themselves. One by one, people stood. Some already managed hotels, others supervised catering companies. One owned a successful bakery. Abigail's confidence shrank with every introduction. Finally, her turn came. She slowly stood. "My name is Abigail Kelly." She paused. "I've worked in restaurant kitchens for almost 10 years. Another pause. I never finished college. Silence. But every place I've worked has taught me something. She looked around the room. I've learned that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what they ordered. The room became unexpectedly quiet. I believe good hospitality begins long before food reaches the table. She smiled nervously. It begins with making sure no one feels invisible. She sat down. No applause followed. None was expected. But several people nodded thoughtfully. Watching from the back of the room through a small observation window stood William Harper. He had insisted on remaining unseen. Claire stood beside him. She doesn't know you're here. I'd rather she never feels she's performing for me. Claire watched Abigail return to her seat. She speaks differently. William smiled. Because she's lived what she's talking about. Over the next several weeks, the application process became another demanding responsibility added to Abigail's already impossible schedule. Every morning still began at 4:30. She baked cinnamon rolls before work, completed 8-hour shifts in the kitchen, returned home to help Ethan with math homework, and listened to Grace practice reading aloud. Only after the children were asleep did she begin studying. Hospitality textbooks slowly replaced television. Flashcards covered the refrigerator door. Financial formulas appeared on sticky notes beside the coffee maker. Grace thought they were decorations. One Saturday morning, she held up a flashcard. What does guest retention mean? Abigail smiled. It means making people want to come back. Grace thought for a moment. Because they're happy. Exactly. Grace nodded proudly. Then you're already good at that. Why? You always make us want to come home. Abigail hugged her tightly. Some lessons no classroom could ever teach. Weeks became months. The apartment settled into a new rhythm. Ethan began preparing breakfast before school. Grace proudly packed everyone's lunches, although Abigail quietly rearranged them afterward whenever the peanut butter somehow ended up beside the apple slices instead of inside the sandwich. Friday family dinner changed too. Restaurants were no longer possible. Instead, they spread an old quilt across the living room floor. They cooked together. Sometimes homemade pizza, sometimes pancakes for dinner, sometimes grilled cheese and tomato soup. Grace still folded a paper swan every Friday before they ate. Only now Abigail placed the newest swan inside her wallet after each meal, replacing the older one that had become soft from constant handling. She carried it everywhere. Whenever exhaustion tempted her to quit studying, she touched the folded paper hidden behind her driver's license. It reminded her of two things: where she had been and where she refused to remain. 3 months into the fellowship, participants were assigned mentors. Abigail expected someone from a hotel chain. Instead, she received monthly coaching sessions from retired hospitality executives who volunteered anonymously through the foundation. Their conversations happened by phone. Her mentor never revealed his name. His voice was calm, patient, curious. During one call, he asked, "What's the first responsibility of a restaurant owner?" She answered immediately, "Serving excellent food." The mentor chuckled softly. "Think again." She remained silent. Finally, he said, "The first responsibility is protecting the dignity of everyone who walks through the door." The sentence struck her deeply. She wrote it down. She read it again before bed. She had no way of knowing those words had once been spoken decades earlier by William Harper himself during the opening meeting of the very first Harbor Table restaurant. Meanwhile, Harbor Table continued losing customers. Online reviews mentioned cold service, high staff turnover, managers who cared more about policies than people. William read every review. Each one felt painfully familiar. He knew buildings didn't lose their soul overnight. They lost it one forgotten value at a time. Late one evening, after another mentoring session, Abigail closed her notebook and looked toward the windowsill. Only one paper swan remained there now. The others rested safely inside a small wooden box she had placed beneath her bed. Grace noticed. "Why did you move them?" Abigail smiled. "I'm saving them." "For what?" She looked at the little paper bird glowing beneath the moonlight. "For the day we finally have a place of our own." Grace grinned. "Then we'll fill every table with swans." Abigail laughed. She kissed her daughter's forehead. Neither of them realized how close that impossible dream had already begun to move toward them. By early spring, Abigail Kelly no longer measured time by the pages on a calendar. She measured it by completed assignments, early bus rides, and the number of paper swans tucked safely inside the wooden box beneath her bed. The fellowship had become more than a program. It had become proof that she still belonged in a world she once believed had moved on without her. 3 evenings each week, she attended leadership workshops at Charleston State University. On Saturdays, after finishing her morning baking orders, she traveled to whichever restaurant had agreed to host her internship that month. Every kitchen was different. Every manager led differently. Some lessons inspired her. Others taught her exactly what she never wanted to become. Her first placement was a small, family-owned seafood cafe near Folly Beach. The owner, Maria Delgado, believed every employee should spend 1 hour each week working outside their normal role. Dishwashers greeted customers, servers helped prep vegetables, managers cleaned tables during busy hours. On Abigail's second day, she asked why. Maria smiled while wiping down a booth. "When people only understand one job, they stop respecting everyone else's." Abigail wrote the sentence into the notebook she carried everywhere. That notebook slowly filled with observations rather than recipes. Leadership is visible during stressful moments. People remember tone longer than words. Never embarrass someone when privacy can solve the problem. Protect employees, and they will protect your guests. At her second internship, she encountered the opposite environment. The restaurant looked beautiful. The culture inside was exhausting. Managers criticized employees in front of customers. Servers competed instead of cooperating. Turnover happened almost every month. One evening, a teenage hostess accidentally entered the wrong reservation. The dining room wasn't even busy. The mistake could have been fixed in less than 2 minutes. Instead, the assistant manager scolded her loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The young hostess apologized repeatedly, her face turning bright red. Abigail watched silently from the service station. She recognized that expression immediately. It was the same one Ethan had worn after Harbor Table, the feeling of becoming smaller while everyone else watched. Later that night, Abigail found the hostess crying behind the restaurant. "I'm probably getting fired." "What happened?" "I made one mistake." Abigail handed her a bottle of water. "You made one mistake." The girl nodded. "That doesn't mean you are one." Those words seemed to surprise even Abigail herself, perhaps because she had needed to hear them months earlier. At the end of the internship, the hostess hugged her tightly. "No manager has ever talked to me like that." Abigail smiled. "I'm not your manager." "Maybe someday you will be." The sentence stayed with her all week. Meanwhile, William Harper continued receiving monthly reports about fellowship participants. Most reports focused on grades, attendance, completed projects. Abigail's contained something different. Restaurant owners repeatedly mentioned her ability to calm conflicts before they became problems. Employees sought her advice, even though she technically outranked no one. Customers remembered her name after meeting her only once. William closed another report and looked across his office toward the framed photograph of the first Harbor Table location. His late wife Margaret stood beside him in the picture, both of them wearing simple aprons on opening day. He remembered how nervous they had been. Neither of them had cared about becoming wealthy. They simply wanted a restaurant where every guest felt they mattered. Somewhere along the way, expansion had replaced purpose. Growth had replaced gratitude. Policies had replaced compassion. Across town, Daniel Harper reviewed quarterly financial reports inside Harbor Table's corporate headquarters. His frustration became obvious. Another location had received poor customer satisfaction scores. Staff retention had dropped again. Marketing expenses continued increasing while repeat customers quietly disappeared. During a board meeting, one executive suggested lowering food costs. Another proposed reducing staff hours. William listened without speaking. Finally, he asked one question. "Has anyone spoken to the employees?" The room fell silent. Daniel answered first. "We've reviewed productivity reports." "I didn't ask about reports." "We've analyzed operational efficiency." "I asked whether anyone has listened." No one answered. William slowly gathered his papers. "You cannot measure culture with a spreadsheet." Daniel sighed. "Father Hospitality is different now." William looked directly at him. "No. It's still exactly the same." He stood. "People simply want to feel welcome." Back at home, life remained beautifully imperfect. Grace continued making paper swans every Friday, only now she insisted each one needed a name. "This one's Hope. This one's Sunny. This one's Brave." Ethan rolled his eyes every week. "You name paper." Grace shrugged. "You name your drawings." He couldn't argue with that. One evening, Ethan surprised Abigail with something unexpected. He had created a floor plan for what he imagined their future restaurant might look like. Every table sat close enough for conversation, but far enough apart for privacy. Large windows overlooked a garden. The kitchen remained visible because, as Ethan explained, people should see where kindness is cooked. Abigail stared at the drawing. "Did you make this?" He nodded shyly. "I remembered what you said." "What did I say?" "A good restaurant feeds people before food even arrives." She realized she had said those words months earlier without thinking. Now her son had built an entire dream around them. She carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside the same wooden box that protected Grace's paper swans. Different dreams, same family. Near the end of the fellowship semester, participants received one final assignment: design a complete improvement plan for an existing restaurant. Most students selected famous businesses or fictional examples. Abigail chose Harbor Table. Not because she wanted revenge, because she understood exactly how much potential had been wasted there. She spent weeks studying customer reviews, employee turnover statistics, menu pricing, community feedback. She never mentioned the night she had been asked to leave. Instead, she focused entirely on solutions: private conflict resolution training, leadership coaching, employee mentorship, a community meal sponsorship program, a guest recovery policy built around dignity rather than punishment. At the very top of her proposal, she wrote a single sentence: "A restaurant earns loyalty when every person who leaves believes they were treated with respect, regardless of how much they spent." She didn't know it, but a copy of that proposal would soon find its way onto William Harper's desk. And once he finished reading it, he would make the decision that changed not only Abigail's future, but the future of Harbor Table itself. Summer arrived with record heat, but inside Harbor Table the atmosphere felt colder than ever. Lunch service used to leave guests waiting for empty tables. Now entire sections of the dining room remained vacant until well past noon. Servers who had once argued over the busiest stations quietly accepted shorter shifts because there simply were not enough customers to serve. Daniel Harper insisted the problem was temporary. "The economy is changing," he told his executive team during another Monday morning meeting. "Families are spending less." No one challenged him. Not because they all agreed, because they had stopped believing their opinions mattered. Across the conference table, William Harper slowly closed a folder filled with customer feedback. He had read every comment twice the night before. Most complaints barely mentioned the food. Instead, they repeated the same words in different forms: rude, dismissive, unwelcome, cold. One review stayed in his mind longer than the others. The soup was excellent, but the manager made my elderly mother feel like she was inconveniencing everyone by asking for a chair with better back support. We won't be returning. William placed the review on the table. What did we do about this? Daniel glanced at the operations director. A coupon was emailed. William waited. And? The customer never responded. William looked around the room. So we apologized with a discount. Silence. We never apologized with respect. The meeting ended without resolution. Daniel left frustrated. His father left disappointed. Neither man realized how differently they defined success. That same week, another experienced server resigned from Harbor Table after 6 years. Her exit interview was short. The guests aren't the reason I'm leaving. The workload, she shook her head. I can handle hard work. The pay. No, she folded her hands together. I'm tired of watching people lose their dignity over small mistakes. The human resources representative looked uncomfortable. Could you explain? The other night, an elderly man accidentally spilled iced tea. She paused. Before I could grab towels, he apologized 6 times because he thought the manager would get angry. The room fell silent. People shouldn't be afraid inside a restaurant. She handed over her name tag. I hope someday someone remembers that. Word of increasing staff turnover eventually reached William through channels that had nothing to do with corporate reports. Former employees still trusted him. Many had worked beside him decades earlier, when Harbor Table consisted of only one location. One afternoon, he invited 3 retired managers to lunch. They met at a small cafe that had no connection to his company. After listening quietly for nearly an hour, William finally asked one question. What changed? The oldest manager answered immediately. We stopped hiring people who loved serving others. What do we hire now? People who know policies. Another former manager nodded. Policies matter, but they can't replace compassion. William looked down at his untouched coffee. He suddenly remembered opening Harbor Table with Margaret, nearly 30 years earlier. Back then, they had kept one handwritten rule taped inside the kitchen. Protect people's dignity first. Everything else came second. The sign had disappeared long ago. No one remembered taking it down. Meanwhile, Abigail's fellowship entered its final stage. Participants were invited to present their improvement projects before a review panel. The room included restaurant owners, hospitality professors, nonprofit leaders, and experienced executives. Abigail stood beside a simple projector screen. She wore the same navy blazer she had borrowed from a neighbor for her interview months earlier. Instead of flashy graphics, her presentation opened with a single photograph. An empty dining table. No guests remember perfect accounting, she began. They remember how they felt when they sat here. She described leadership as emotional architecture. Restaurants didn't simply organize food. They organized experiences. Every greeting, every apology, every decision either strengthened trust or quietly damaged it. One reviewer interrupted. How would you measure respect? Abigail smiled thoughtfully. I wouldn't start by measuring respect. The panel leaned forward. I'd start by measuring whether employees feel safe enough to admit mistakes. Another evaluator asked, and customers. If a guest leaves embarrassed when a private conversation could have solved the problem, she paused. Then the restaurant has already failed. William watched the presentation remotely through a secure live stream provided to fellowship sponsors. He said almost nothing during the entire hour. When Abigail finished, the room remained quiet for several seconds before applause slowly spread through the audience. Not because her proposal was dramatic, because it felt deeply true. Later that afternoon, Olivia Bennett invited Abigail into her office. The fellowship director smiled warmly. You've done extraordinary work. Thank you. We'd like permission to share your proposal with several hospitality organizations. Abigail looked genuinely surprised. My proposal. It deserves to be read. She hesitated. If it helps someone. Olivia nodded. I think it will. Within days, copies reached restaurant groups across South Carolina. One copy landed quietly on William Harper's desk. He read it late that evening while sitting alone inside the library of his waterfront home. Every page reminded him of conversations he and Margaret had shared decades earlier. Near the end, Abigail included one paragraph that stopped him completely. A restaurant becomes part of a family's memories. The meal may last 1 hour, but the feeling people carry home can remain for years. Owners should never underestimate the emotional responsibility that comes with serving another human being. William removed his glasses. He stared out the window toward Charleston Harbor. He no longer saw water. He saw a frightened little girl clutching a paper swan. He saw a quiet boy blaming himself for ordering orange juice. He saw a mother apologizing for circumstances beyond her control while still keeping her promise to return and pay every cent she owed. He folded the proposal carefully and placed it beside the paper swan. For months he had wondered whether Harbor Table could still become what it was meant to be. Now another question replaced it. Who should be trusted to lead that change? The answer seemed increasingly obvious. At Harbor Table, however, Daniel continued making decisions based entirely on financial reports. He approved another reduction in staffing hours, another marketing campaign, another cost-cutting initiative. None addressed the growing emptiness inside the dining rooms. Guests continued leaving. Employees continued resigning. Online ratings continued falling. Finally, the board of directors requested an emergency review of Harbor Table's future. Several underperforming locations were discussed. Then someone raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if we sell the flagship restaurant before it loses more value? The room became silent. Selling Harbor Table's original Charleston location would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. Now it sounded practical. William closed his eyes briefly. The building where he and Margaret had poured their hearts into every brick might soon belong to someone else. Unless the right person appeared at exactly the right moment. He already suspected that person had no idea her life was about to change again. 3 weeks after the emergency board meeting, an unexpected headline appeared in Charleston's business journal. Historic Harbor Table, flagship listed for sale. The article spread quickly through the local restaurant community. Some people dismissed it as another corporate restructuring. Others assumed a large hospitality chain would purchase the property within days. Abigail almost missed the article entirely. She was standing in line at a neighborhood bakery picking up flour when she noticed the magazine beside the register. The familiar photograph of Harbor Table caught her attention immediately. She bought the magazine with the last $3 in her purse. That evening, after Grace and Ethan had gone to bed, she read every word. The building, the kitchen equipment, the Harbor Table name. Everything was available as part of a complete ownership transition. She closed the magazine and laughed quietly. Imagine that. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. People like her didn't buy restaurants, they worked in them. Still before going to sleep, she found herself sketching ideas inside her notebook. Not because she believed she would ever own Harbor Table, because imagining a better version of it somehow felt healing. The next afternoon, Olivia Bennett called unexpectedly. I'd like to meet if you have time. Abigail assumed they wanted feedback about the fellowship. Instead, Olivia placed a newspaper clipping on the table between them. Harbor Table. You've seen this? Abigail nodded. I have. What did you think? She smiled politely. I thought whoever buys it has an incredible opportunity. And if that person were you? Abigail laughed. I think you're talking to the wrong woman. Olivia folded her hands. I don't believe I am. Silence settled over the room. I don't have investors. You don't know that. I don't have money. You've built something more valuable. Abigail looked confused. What? A reputation. Olivia continued. Do you know why community investment funds exist? To help small businesses. No, she smiled. To help trustworthy people build small businesses. Those words lingered. For the first time, the impossible idea no longer sounded completely impossible. Over the following week, Olivia introduced Abigail to several members of the Charleston Community Business Fund. No promises were made. No one discussed writing checks. Instead, they asked questions. Hundreds of questions. What would make Harbor Table different? How would you reduce turnover? What happens during a recession? Why should customers return? Abigail answered each one honestly. She never exaggerated. When she didn't know something, she admitted it. I'll learn, one investor smiled. That's a better answer than pretending. Another meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Whiteboards filled with numbers, projected revenue, food costs, payroll, maintenance, equipment replacement, marketing. Abigail worked late into the night, refining every estimate. Ethan often found her asleep at the kitchen table, with spreadsheets spread across 3 notebooks. One Saturday morning, he quietly placed a blanket over her shoulders before leaving for soccer practice. She woke an hour later. The blanket was tucked carefully around her. A fresh cup of coffee sat beside her calculator. No note. She knew Ethan had made it. Grace contributed in her own way. Every Friday, she added another paper swan beside Abigail's paperwork. This one is for brave business people. Abigail smiled every single time. Meanwhile, William Harper deliberately stayed out of every discussion. He had made one decision very early. If Abigail succeeded, it would be because her plan deserved support, not because he intervened. When Olivia eventually contacted him, she asked directly, "The community fund is considering participating." William nodded. "I know. We're still short." "How much?" She gave him the number. He looked toward the paper swan resting on his desk. "I'll participate." "As the lead investor?" "No." She looked surprised. "As one investor among many." "Why?" "Because ownership earned through partnership lasts longer than ownership handed over." Olivia smiled. "I suspected you'd say that." Back at Harbor Table, Daniel struggled to find buyers willing to pay the asking price. Most interested companies planned to replace the restaurant entirely. Luxury condominiums, retail space, a national franchise. None intended to preserve Harbor Table's identity. William quietly rejected every proposal. If the building survives but the purpose disappears, he looked across the conference room. Then we've already lost. Several board members disagreed. Others understood. The debate continued for weeks. During that time, Abigail's business plan grew from 40 pages to nearly 100. She included employee development programs, emergency assistance resources for staff, private customer resolution procedures, community cooking classes, a mentorship program for young culinary students. Most importantly, she proposed creating a pay-forward dinner fund, allowing customers to anonymously purchase future meals for families experiencing temporary hardship. She never explained where that idea had come from. She didn't need to. One evening, while reviewing the proposal, Ethan noticed a sentence highlighted 3 times. "Everyone deserves to finish their meal with dignity." He looked at his mother. "That sounds familiar." She smiled softly. "It should." "Did you write it?" "No." "Who did?" She thought for a long moment. Life did. The official presentation to the investment committee took place inside a modest conference room overlooking Charleston Harbor. Abigail wore the same navy blazer again. This time she wasn't nervous about public speaking. She was nervous because every answer mattered. Committee members questioned every assumption. What if sales don't recover? What if labor costs increase? What if tourism declines? She answered carefully. Then one investor asked something completely unexpected. Why do you want this restaurant? The room became quiet. Abigail closed her notebook. She spoke without reading a single note. I don't want the building. Heads lifted. I don't want the name. More silence. I want what this place was always supposed to mean. She paused. I believe restaurants become part of family history. She looked around the room. A birthday. A first date. A graduation. A final meal with someone you love. Her voice remained calm. If people trust you with those memories. She smiled gently. You have an obligation to treat them with extraordinary care. No one interrupted. I can't promise every meal will be perfect, she continued. But I can promise no child will ever leave believing they embarrassed their family because they were poor. Across the table, Olivia quietly lowered her pen. Several committee members exchanged thoughtful glances. Outside the conference room window, the afternoon sun reflected across Charleston Harbor. Inside, something equally significant had begun to shift. For the first time, the people deciding Harbor Table's future were no longer imagining whether Abigail Kelly could become a restaurant owner. They were beginning to wonder whether anyone else deserved the opportunity more. The final decision meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday of September. Abigail circled the date on the kitchen calendar nearly a month in advance. She tried not to think about it. She failed every day. Her life continued as usual. She still woke before dawn to bake cinnamon rolls. She still packed Ethan's lunch before reminding Grace to brush her teeth a second time because the little girl somehow always forgot the back teeth. She still rode the city bus, carrying the same worn leather bag filled with notebooks instead of expensive briefcases. Nothing about her daily routine suggested she might soon become the owner of one of Charleston's best-known restaurants. And yet every ordinary moment now carried extraordinary weight. On the morning of the meeting, Ethan walked into the kitchen wearing his school backpack. He noticed his mother staring at a spreadsheet without actually reading it. You've checked that page 5 times. I know. It hasn't changed. I know that too. He poured coffee into her favorite blue mug. You've already done the hard part. She looked up. I have. You became the person who could sit in that meeting. His words surprised her. When did you get so wise? He shrugged. I live with you. Grace wandered into the kitchen moments later, still wearing mismatched socks. She held something carefully behind her back. I made one more, another paper swan. Unlike the others, this one had tiny gold stars drawn across its wings using a metallic marker borrowed from school. This one is different, Grace explained. Why? Because today is a brave day. Abigail smiled through nervous eyes. I think you're right. She tucked the swan into the inside pocket of her notebook before leaving the apartment. The meeting took place inside the Charleston Community Business Fund headquarters. Unlike previous presentations, today's room felt smaller, more serious. Representatives from the community fund sat on one side. 2 local bank officers sat across from them. The Harbor Table Board had also sent observers. William Harper entered quietly a few minutes before the meeting began. He took a seat near the back. Daniel Harper sat several chairs away. Neither man spoke. Olivia Bennett opened the discussion. Today we are reviewing the final acquisition proposal submitted by Miss Abigail Kelly. She turned toward Abigail. You may begin. Abigail stood. She didn't open her prepared speech. Instead, she looked around the room. I've spent months talking about numbers. A few people smiled. So today I'd rather talk about responsibility. She paused. A restaurant doesn't belong to the owner. Several eyebrows lifted. It belongs to every family that celebrates there, she continued calmly. It belongs to every employee who misses birthdays because they're serving someone else's celebration. It belongs to every dishwasher who stays late after closing. Every hostess who remembers returning customers by name. Every child who believes dinner with their family is the best part of the week. No one interrupted. She finally opened her proposal. I believe profitability and compassion should never compete. She explained revised financial forecasts, more efficient purchasing systems, employee retention initiatives, cross-training programs, community partnerships with local farms, paid leadership development for hourly workers, emergency financial assistance for employees facing temporary hardship. Every answer came with practical details, not dreams, plans. One banker leaned forward. Your payroll projections are higher than current industry averages. They are. Why? Because replacing good employees costs more than keeping them. He nodded slowly. Another investor asked, You're proposing paid training hours? Yes. Most restaurants don't. I know. Why should Harbor Table? Abigail smiled, because excellence isn't an accident. It's practiced. Daniel listened silently. He had expected idealism. Instead, he heard disciplined planning supported by careful research. For the first time, he found himself reading sections of her proposal he had previously dismissed. Then came the hardest question. One board member adjusted his glasses. Miss Kelly, he hesitated, you've never owned a restaurant. No. You've never managed one. No. Why should we trust you with Harbor Table? The room became perfectly still. Abigail looked down briefly before answering. You shouldn't trust me because I've held the title. She looked back up. You should trust me because I've spent 10 years learning every job beneath that title. She continued quietly. I've washed dishes, prepared vegetables, baked bread, covered overnight shifts, comforted overwhelmed coworkers, worked double shifts after someone called in sick. I know what exhaustion looks like. I know what invisible feels like, she paused. And I know exactly how one careless decision from a manager can stay with a child for the rest of their life. She never mentioned Harbor Table. She never needed to. William lowered his eyes. Daniel stared at the table. Everyone else understood there was a story beneath those words. Olivia announced a short recess while the committee deliberated privately. Abigail stepped into the hallway. Her hands finally began shaking. For the first time all morning, she walked toward a large window overlooking Charleston Harbor. The water looked calm. She wasn't. A familiar voice spoke gently behind her. You handled yourself well. She turned. William Harper. She recognized him instantly, not by name, by his face. The elderly gentleman who had been sitting near the window at Harbor Table on the night everything changed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. I remember you, Abigail said softly. William smiled. I wondered if you would. You were there. I was. She searched his expression. I always wanted to ask. He nodded. You lost something that evening. He reached inside his jacket. Very carefully, he unfolded a small piece of white paper. Grace's swan. The fold marks had softened over time. One wing had been repaired almost invisibly with archival tape. Abigail covered her mouth. You kept it. William looked at the little bird resting in his weathered hands. I needed something to remind me what we almost lost. She accepted it gently, afraid even now to damage its fragile wings. My daughter thought it might help someone remember to be kind. William's eyes grew moist. It did. Before Abigail could ask another question, Olivia stepped into the hallway. The committee is ready? Everyone returned to the conference room. The atmosphere felt different, more hopeful. Olivia stood. The Charleston Community Business Fund has reached its decision. Abigail unconsciously tightened her grip around the paper swan hidden beneath the table. We unanimously approve financing participation. Her heart skipped. The partnering investors have also confirmed their commitments. She barely breathed. The bank has approved the remaining commercial loan contingent upon final closing. Olivia smiled warmly. Congratulations, Miss Kelly. You are now the approved purchaser of Harbor Table. For a moment, Abigail simply stared, not because she hadn't heard the words, because after everything life had taken from her, she had forgotten what impossible sounded like when it finally became real. The first morning Abigail Kelly unlocked Harbor Table, the sun had not yet risen. Charleston's waterfront was wrapped in a pale blue mist, and the restaurant stood quietly against the harbor, its familiar brick walls catching the first hints of dawn. For a long moment, she simply stared at the front entrance. Exactly 1 year earlier, she had walked through those same doors carrying her children by the hand. She had left carrying humiliation. Today she carried a ring of brass keys. They felt surprisingly heavy, not because of the metal, because of everything they represented. She unlocked the front door. The old hinges creaked softly. The dining room smelled faintly of coffee-polished wood and memories. Rows of empty tables stretched before her. Grace slipped her small hand into Abigail's. Mom. Yes. Does this mean we're allowed to stay now? Abigail knelt beside her daughter. We always deserved to stay. Grace thought about that for a moment before smiling. I like that answer better. Ethan quietly wandered toward the large front window. This place looks smaller. Abigail smiled. No. We're just seeing it differently. At exactly 7 o'clock, employees began arriving. Some looked nervous, others looked skeptical. Most had no idea what kind of owner Abigail would become. Among the last to enter was Mark Reynolds. His shoulders were stiff. His face carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks expecting bad news. He approached slowly. I understand if today's my last day. Abigail looked at him for several seconds before answering. We're having a staff meeting first. He nodded. I'll wait. Within half an hour, every employee gathered inside the dining room. Servers, cooks, dishwashers, hosts, bartenders, maintenance workers. Many expected announcements about layoffs. Others assumed management positions would immediately change. Abigail stood near the center of the room without using the small stage. She wanted to stand with them, not above them. Good morning. A quiet chorus answered. I know many of you are wondering what's going to happen. She paused. So am I. A few nervous laughs spread through the room. I'm not here because I know everything. I'm here because I know what this restaurant can become. She looked around carefully. I will never promise perfection. But I will promise honesty, she continued. No one is losing their job today simply because ownership changed. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. If changes happen, she continued, they'll happen because of choices. Not titles, not history. Choices. A dishwasher near the back slowly relaxed his shoulders. A young hostess quietly exhaled. Then Abigail held up a blank index card. Before anyone starts working today, I'd like each of you to answer one question. She smiled. You don't need to write your name. The cards were distributed. The question read, what is one thing that keeps you from doing your best work here? No one had expected that. Employees looked at one another uncertainly. Within minutes, the cards began returning. Not enough staff during dinner rush. Broken equipment never repaired. Managers who corrected people in front of guests. Schedules changed without notice. No opportunities for advancement. Feeling invisible. Abigail read every card herself. She didn't skim, she didn't delegate. She read every sentence. Many repeated the same concerns. Different handwriting. Same pain. Later that morning, she walked through every part of the building. Kitchen, storage rooms, office, walk-in refrigerator, laundry area, employee break room. The break room stopped her. One broken microwave, 3 mismatched plastic chairs, a coffee maker held together with tape. The room where employees recovered from exhausting shifts looked more neglected than any dining area. She quietly wrote something inside her notebook. If we expect people to care for guests, we must first care for the people serving them. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds waited inside his office. He had already cleaned out one desk drawer. A framed photograph of his family rested inside a cardboard box. He heard a gentle knock. "Come in." Abigail stepped inside. She looked around. The office felt strangely empty despite years of accumulated paperwork. "You've packed?" "I assumed." She nodded. "I understand." Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Mark looked directly at her. "I was wrong." There was no excuse, no explanation. Only 4 simple words. "I was wrong." Abigail noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. Not fear of unemployment, something deeper. Regret. "I've replayed that night more times than I can count." He continued quietly. "I kept telling myself I was following policy." His voice faltered. "But policies don't wake you up at 2 in the morning. Memories do." Abigail listened without interrupting. "I remembered your little girl asking if she'd done something bad." He swallowed. "I have grandchildren. I can't stop hearing that question." Silence filled the office. Finally, he said, "I don't deserve another chance." Abigail looked out the office window toward the dining room. "You know," she began softly, "a year ago, I thought about what I'd do if I ever owned this restaurant." Mark lowered his eyes. "I imagined firing you." He nodded slowly. "I would have." She continued, "But something changed." "What?" She smiled faintly. "I realized revenge creates new victims." She turned back toward him. "I'm not interested in that." Mark looked genuinely confused. "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm making a decision." She placed a folder on his desk. He opened it. Inside was a 6-week leadership development program. Conflict resolution, coaching, emotional intelligence, guest recovery, private communication, respect-based management. He looked up. "What is this?" "If you want to remain here," she answered calmly. "So, you'll complete every session. You'll work alongside every department. You'll spend 1 shift washing dishes, 1 greeting guests, 1 serving tables, 1 cleaning after closing." He stared at the folder. "And if I refuse, you'll leave with a fair recommendation. No anger. No humiliation. Your choice." His eyes slowly filled. "You trust me after everything?" Abigail shook her head. "No. I'm giving you the opportunity to earn trust." "They're different things." Later that afternoon, William Harper quietly entered Harbor Table for the first time since the ownership transfer. He stood unnoticed near the entrance. Across the dining room, he watched Abigail carrying a tray of coffee to employees who were still attending orientation. She wasn't acting like someone who owned the building. She was acting like someone responsible for every person inside it. William smiled. Margaret would have approved. As he turned to leave, he noticed something resting on every table, a single folded white paper swan. The dining room remained empty. The restaurant had not officially reopened. Yet somehow the building already felt warmer than it had in years. Not because the furniture had changed, because the people inside had begun changing first. And Abigail knew that rebuilding Harbor Table would never begin with new menus or fresh paint. It would begin by restoring something far more fragile, the dignity that had quietly disappeared from the building long before she ever walked through its doors. Harbor Table officially reopened 3 weeks later. The announcement drew attention throughout Charleston. Some came because they remembered the restaurant from years ago. Others came because local newspapers had reported that a former kitchen worker had become its new owner. Abigail politely declined every interview that focused only on her personal story. "If people come," she told the reporters, "I hope they come because they feel welcome, not because they feel sorry for me." Word spread anyway. Long before the lunch rush began on opening day, every reservation had been filled. Employees arrived almost 2 hours early, not because Abigail had ordered them to, because they wanted everything to be perfect. The break room no longer looked forgotten. Fresh paint covered the walls. Comfortable chairs replaced the broken plastic ones. A new coffee station stood beside a shelf filled with books about leadership cooking and customer service. Above the lockers hung a framed sign. Not a company slogan, just one sentence. "Respect begins behind this door." Several employees paused to read it before starting work. Mark Reynolds stood among them. He had completed every leadership session Abigail assigned. Every Tuesday morning he attended workshops. Every Thursday afternoon he shadowed employees from departments he had barely noticed before. He had washed dishes beside Miguel, who had quietly worked at Harbor Table for 14 years. He had greeted guests alongside 19-year-old hostess Claire, learning how much courage it took to smile after being ignored dozens of times a day. He had cleaned dining rooms after closing with the overnight crew. For the first time in his career, he understood the jobs he had once supervised from a distance. The change wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, real. One afternoon, during the training, he privately asked Miguel, "Why didn't anyone ever tell me things were this difficult?" Miguel smiled without bitterness. "We tried." "You did. You were always too busy talking." Those words stayed with Mark longer than any management seminar. On reopening morning, Abigail gathered everyone before unlocking the front doors. She held no microphone, no prepared speech, only a small folded piece of paper. When everyone settled, she slowly unfolded it. Grace's original paper swan. The room became silent. "This little bird," Abigail began softly, "was made by my daughter 1 year ago." No one moved. "It was left here on the hardest night our family ever experienced." She looked around the room. "I almost threw away that memory." She smiled gently. "But someone chose to preserve it instead." Several employees glanced toward William Harper, who stood quietly near the back beside Olivia Bennett. He lowered his eyes but said nothing. Abigail continued, "I don't want this restaurant to become known for my story. I want it to become known for yours." She looked at every employee individually. The family celebrating an anniversary. The dishwasher sending his daughter to college. The hostess working her first job. The cook supporting aging parents. The child eating out for the first time. She placed the paper swan on the welcome desk. "If we remember their stories." She paused. "We'll never forget why we're here." The doors opened. The first guests entered. Business was steady from the very beginning. Not perfect, just warm, natural. A young server accidentally spilled iced tea during the lunch rush. The entire dining room froze for a brief second. Many employees instinctively looked toward Mark. Months earlier, he would have raised his voice. Instead, he grabbed towels, smiled at the customer, and said, "I'm sorry." "Let's take care of that together." The elderly guest laughed. "I've been spilling drinks since 1958. The tension disappeared immediately. From across the room, Abigail noticed. She didn't interrupt. She simply smiled. People weren't changing because they feared punishment. They were changing because they finally understood what leadership looked like. That afternoon, William asked if Abigail had a few minutes. They walked onto the quiet patio overlooking Charleston Harbor after the lunch crowd settled. For several moments, they watched boats drift across the water. Finally, William spoke. "I owe you something." Abigail shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do?" He took a slow breath. "The night you were asked to leave?" His voice softened. I should have stood up. She looked at him quietly. I told myself I needed to understand the whole situation. I convinced myself there might be something I hadn't seen. He paused. The truth is, I hesitated. Abigail didn't answer immediately. She understood the weight behind those words. When my wife was alive, William continued, she never hesitated. If someone needed kindness, she moved. He smiled sadly. I've spent the last year wondering what she would have done. Abigail looked out across the harbor. I've wondered something too. What? What would have happened if nobody had picked up Grace's swan? William reached into his jacket pocket. This time he removed a small photograph. It showed Harbor Table on opening day, nearly 30 years earlier. Margaret stood beside him holding a handwritten sign. Abigail looked closer. The sign read, "Everyone leaves fed in more ways than one." William smiled through moist eyes. That was her idea. I forgot it. You reminded me. For the first time since they met, Abigail fully understood why this elderly man had fought so hard to preserve Harbor Table. It wasn't about a building, it was about a promise. Before they returned inside, William handed her another envelope. I'm not accepting more money. She smiled. He laughed softly. I know. It's not money. Inside was the original handwritten mission statement Margaret had written decades earlier. The paper had yellowed with age. Some ink had faded. At the bottom, Margaret had signed her name. William said quietly, "It belongs here." Abigail held the fragile page with both hands. It belongs where people will read it every day. That evening after the restaurant closed, she framed it herself. She hung it in the employee hallway, not in the dining room, not where customers would praise it, where every employee would pass it before beginning work. The next morning, Mark stopped in front of the frame. He read every word slowly. When he reached the final line, he stood motionless. Every guest deserves to leave with both a full stomach and an unbroken spirit. He quietly removed his manager's name badge. For one terrifying second, Abigail thought he intended to resign. Instead, he walked into her office. He placed the badge on her desk. I'd like a new one. She looked confused. Why? He smiled for the first time in months. The title can stay the same. But I'd like to become the kind of manager who actually deserves wearing it. Abigail handed the badge back. You already started. Outside her office, Grace sat at a corner table folding another paper swan. Without looking up, she whispered to Ethan, I think the restaurant is happy now. Ethan glanced around the dining room filled with laughter conversations and people lingering long after finishing their meals. He smiled. So do I. By the beginning of November, Harbor Table no longer looked like the restaurant people remembered. The brick walls were the same. The large windows still overlooked Charleston Harbor. The wooden floors still carried the gentle creak of decades of footsteps. But something invisible had changed. People lingered. Families no longer hurried through dinner. Servers laughed with regular customers. Employees stayed after their shifts simply to help one another finish closing duties. The building had begun to breathe again. On a crisp Friday morning, Abigail arrived before sunrise carrying 2 cardboard boxes. Grace skipped beside her. What are those? The last surprise? They carried the boxes into the dining room together. Inside were hundreds of neatly folded paper swans. Grace gasped. You made these? Abigail smiled. I had help. Over the previous month, employees had spent their lunch breaks learning to fold paper from Grace. Miguel, who had washed dishes for 14 years, proudly claimed he finally made one that looked like a bird instead of a napkin. The servers held friendly competitions. Even Mark struggled through dozens before producing one Grace declared acceptable. Now every table in Harbor Table would receive one. Each swan rested beside a small cream-colored card. The card contained only one sentence. Everyone deserves to finish their meal with dignity. Nothing else. No company logo. No explanation. Guests would discover the meaning through experience rather than advertising. At the hostess stand stood another edition, a simple wooden box. Above it hung a handwritten sign, "Pay Forward Dinner." Beneath the title appeared a short message. If you would like to quietly purchase a future meal for a family experiencing temporary hardship, you may do so here. No names will be shared, only kindness. Abigail refused to place photographs beside it. She refused to tell her own story, compassion she believed should never depend upon publicity. Before opening that morning, she gathered the staff once more. The dinner fund belongs to everyone. She looked around the room. No guest who receives help will ever know who paid. No guest who gives will know who received. Several employees nodded. Miguel smiled, just like neighbors used to do. Exactly, Abigail answered. William Harper arrived just before the doors opened. He walked slowly through the dining room, stopping at table after table. Every paper swan looked slightly different. Some leaned to one side. Some spread their wings wider than others. None were identical. He smiled. Margaret had always believed handmade things carried part of the person who created them. Perhaps that was why the room already felt warmer. At 11 o'clock, the first guests entered. Business remained steady throughout lunch. Many people noticed the paper swans. Children immediately picked them up with curiosity. Parents read the small cards aloud. Some smiled quietly. Others asked their servers about the meaning. The explanation was always simple. Our owner believes everyone deserves dignity. Nothing more. No dramatic speeches. No carefully rehearsed marketing. By mid-afternoon, something unexpected happened. A retired teacher approached the hostess stand. "I'd like to pay for 2 future dinners." An hour later, a young couple celebrating their engagement purchased 3 more. Before sunset, a construction crew eating lunch together contributed enough for 6 families. No one asked who would receive the meals. They simply trusted someone eventually would. Mark watched the wooden box slowly fill throughout the day. Late that evening after closing, he entered Abigail's office. "The fund already has enough for 28 dinners," she smiled. "People were waiting for permission." "What do you mean?" "They've always wanted to help. They just needed a simple way." Mark looked thoughtfully toward the dining room. "I spent years believing management meant controlling people. And now, I think it means removing obstacles that keep people from being their best." Abigail nodded. "I couldn't have said it better." The following Saturday, Harbor Table hosted its first community cooking workshop. Admission was free. Children cooked alongside grandparents. Teenagers learned knife safety from professional chefs. Local farmers spoke about fresh produce. Ethan volunteered to organize supplies. Grace proudly demonstrated how to fold paper swans after class ended. One little boy frowned at his crumpled attempt. "I can't do it." Grace gently unfolded the paper. "My first ones looked funny too." "They did," she nodded seriously. "The important part isn't making it perfect. It's making another one." Nearby adults smiled without interrupting. Children often taught lessons no seminar ever could. Toward the end of the afternoon, William found himself standing beside Abigail on the restaurant patio. Families laughed inside. Harbor Table felt alive. "You've done something remarkable," he said. Abigail shook her head. "We have." William smiled. "That's another reason you've succeeded." She looked toward the harbor. "When I first walked in here as the owner," she paused, "I thought rebuilding meant changing the restaurant. And I've realized the restaurant was never the real project. What was helping people believe in one another again." William remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket. He removed Margaret's old recipe notebook. The leather cover had softened with age. "I've been saving this." Abigail accepted it carefully. The original Harbor Table recipes. She opened the first page. In Margaret's handwriting appeared a short note. Food fills the stomach. Kindness fills the memory. Abigail closed the notebook slowly. I'll take good care of it. I know. That evening after the last guest departed, the staff gathered for a simple meal before heading home. Nothing fancy. Soup, fresh bread, roasted vegetables. Everyone sat together. Owners, managers, dishwashers, servers, hosts. No separate tables, no reserved seats. Grace looked around proudly. This is my favorite family dinner night. Miguel laughed. I think we've become one big family. Abigail raised her glass of iced tea. To everyone who helped Harbor Table become a place where people feel welcome again. Everyone echoed the toast. As laughter filled the room, the camera of a local newspaper photographer quietly captured the moment through the front window. The photograph appeared on Sunday's front page, not because Harbor Table had become Charleston's newest success story, but because the headline captured something much more meaningful. The restaurant where kindness is always on the menu. None of them realized that the true test of everything they had built was still waiting just around the corner. It would arrive not with reporters' awards or applause. It would walk through the front door as quietly as Abigail once had. Almost exactly 1 year after Abigail Kelly had walked out of Harbor Table, with tears hidden behind a steady smile, another cold Friday evening settled over Charleston. The restaurant was full. Soft conversations floated through the dining room. Children colored paper menus while waiting for grilled cheese sandwiches. An elderly couple celebrated their 52nd wedding anniversary near the window where William Harper liked to sit. The wooden box labeled "Pay Forward Dinner" rested quietly beside the hostess stand. No one paid much attention to it anymore. It had simply become part of Harbor Table. Every week, anonymous gifts appeared inside. Every week, anonymous meals quietly disappeared, exactly as Abigail had hoped. She was helping the kitchen prepare soup when the hostess approached. Abigail. She looked up. I think someone needs you. Abigail dried her hands on a kitchen towel and stepped into the dining room. Near the entrance stood a young woman wearing a faded denim jacket despite the chilly weather. Beside her were 2 children, a little boy holding a toy dinosaur with one missing leg. A girl no older than Grace had been a year earlier. The woman clutched her wallet tightly. I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. I didn't realize prices had changed since the menu online. She looked at the hostess. We've already eaten. Her eyes filled with embarrassment. I'm short. She quickly emptied her wallet. Several crumpled $1 bills. Loose coins. Not enough. Abigail felt the room around her quietly disappear. For just a heartbeat, she wasn't standing inside Harbor Table anymore. She was back 1 year earlier. Grace's frightened eyes, Ethan blaming himself for orange juice, the paper swan sliding across the wooden floor. She took one slow breath. Then she smiled. What are your children's names? The woman looked surprised. Tyler. She gently touched the boy's shoulder. And Emma. The little girl hid behind her mother. They're beautiful. The mother looked confused. I still owe money. Abigail shook her head gently. You don't? The woman frowned. I don't understand. Abigail walked toward the small wooden box beside the hostess stand. She lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of meal cards. She selected one. Returning to the family, she placed it quietly beside the receipt. Tonight's dinner has already been paid for. The young mother stared at the card. By who? Abigail smiled. Someone who hoped this meal would find the right family. Tears rolled freely down the woman's face. I can't accept charity. It's not charity, Abigail answered softly. It's kindness. There's a difference. The woman covered her mouth. I don't know how to thank them. You already can. How? When life becomes a little easier, Abigail glanced toward the wooden box. Help someone else? The little boy looked up. So we don't owe anything. Abigail crouched beside him. You owe one thing. What? Keep believing that good people exist. He smiled. I can do that. Nearby, several employees quietly watched the exchange. No one applauded. No one made a scene. They simply returned to work, because preserving someone's dignity meant allowing the moment to remain private. From his usual table near the window, William Harper wiped quietly at the corner of one eye. He remembered another frightened child standing in almost the same place. Only this time, the story had ended differently. Grace came skipping out from the kitchen carrying a stack of clean paper napkins. She noticed the little girl immediately. Hi. Emma smiled shyly. Hi. Grace sat beside her. Do you know how to make a paper swan? Emma shook her head. No. I'll teach you. The two girls folded paper together while their mothers spoke quietly nearby. The first attempt collapsed. Grace laughed. Mine used to do that too. She unfolded the paper patiently. We just try again. A second attempt, then a third. Finally, a tiny swan stood proudly on the table. Emma's face lit up. It looks funny, Grace grinned. My first one looked funnier. Emma giggled. What does it do? Grace thought for a second before answering exactly as she had 1 year earlier. It reminds people they're welcome. William closed his eyes. The same words, the same hope. Only now they belonged to another child. Later that evening, after the family had gone home, Abigail locked the front doors. Employees gathered for their usual closing meal. William remained behind. When everyone finished eating, he slowly stood. I have something I'd like to say. The room became quiet. He looked first at Abigail, then at every employee. A long time ago, he began, my wife and I dreamed of opening a restaurant. We thought success would mean full tables. He smiled gently. We were wrong. He looked toward the dining room. Success is hearing children laugh without fear. It's watching employees feel respected. It's seeing strangers quietly care for people they'll never meet. His eyes settled on the paper swan resting at the center of every table. This building belongs to all of you now. Not because your names are on the paperwork, but because your hearts are in these walls. Silence filled the room, the peaceful kind, the kind that follows truth. After everyone left, Abigail remained alone in the dining room. The lights had been dimmed. Moonlight reflected across Charleston Harbor. She walked slowly to the same table where her family had once sat. She placed Grace's original paper swan beside the salt shaker, exactly where it had rested 1 year earlier. Only this time there were no frightened children, no raised voices, no shame, just quiet gratitude. She smiled as she whispered to herself, "We came back." Then she gently picked up the swan, turned off the final light, and locked the door behind her. Outside, through the large front window, dozens of white paper swans rested on empty tables waiting patiently for tomorrow's guests. Somewhere another family was struggling. Somewhere another child wondered whether kindness still existed. Tomorrow Harbor Table would answer that question again, and the little paper swan, born from the careful hands of a 5-year-old girl, would continue carrying hope from one table to another, one family to another, one generation to the next. Life has a way of testing us in the moments when no one is watching. Sometimes the greatest pain doesn't come from losing money or opportunities, it comes from feeling invisible. But this story reminds us that dignity is something no circumstance can take unless we surrender it ourselves. Abigail didn't become the owner of a restaurant because someone rescued her. She became the owner because she kept her word, continued learning when quitting would have been easier, and chose compassion over revenge when she finally had power. Real success isn't measured by how high we climb. It's measured by how gently we treat the people still climbing. A single act of kindness may seem small, but you never know how far it will travel. A paper swan folded by a little girl became a symbol that changed a restaurant, restored a community, and reminded countless strangers that they mattered. Your smallest gesture today might become someone else's reason to keep going tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's kindness changed your life? Share your story in the comments because someone reading it may need that hope today. If you believe the world needs more stories about compassion, resilience, and second chances, please share this video with someone you care about and subscribe for more journeys that remind us of the very best in humanity.